So we'll turn into Mark chapter 5. Mark chapter 5, and we're going to enter into a time when there is restoration and healing at the hands of Jesus. Mark chapter 5, starting at verse 21. It says, when Jesus had crossed again in a boat, remember the first time he crossed over the Sea of Galilee and went over to the region of the Gerasenes, that Gentile region where he performed the miracles of casting all those demons out of that man. And now he's heading back to the other side of the lake again. Verse 21 there. And it tells us that a large crowd gathered around him, and he was by the sea. We see that happening, I'm not sure how many times in the Gospels, especially here in the book of Mark. A large crowd gathered near or around Jesus while he happened to be by the sea. Well, then one of the synagogue rulers named Jairus came up, and when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet. He asked him urgently, "My little daughter is near death, but come and lay your hands on her so that she may be healed and live." Jesus went with him, and a large crowd followed and pressed around him. Well, now a woman was there who had been suffering from a hemorrhage for 12 years. She had endured a great deal under many physicians, the care of many doctors, and she had spent all that she had. Yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. And then verse 27, when she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. Now remember, we've had these accounts where crowds would press around Jesus for various reasons. Here in this account, verse 27, she came up behind Jesus in the crowd because she heard Jesus was there. And she in the crowd then reached out to touch his cloak. For she kept saying, if only I touch his clothes, I will be healed, she kept saying. If only I can just reach out and touch him. The woman was trying repeatedly to muster up the courage to touch Jesus' cloak. You know, we'd have probably been the same way too, right? If only I touch his clothes, I will be healed, or I will be saved. Well, at once the bleeding that she had stopped. The flow of her blood dried up. The woman was most likely suffering from a vaginal hemorrhage, in which case her bleeding would make her ritually unclean. That's one of the things that would happen among women according to Jewish law. is that if they had this kind of bleeding, they would become ritually unclean. But now she discovered that the bleeding had stopped. Still, she had been marked out as being ritually unclean. The bleeding had stopped there in verse 29, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. Well, Jesus knew at once the power had gone out from her. He turned around in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" His disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing against you, and you say, 'Who touched me?'" But he looked around to see who had done it. Then the woman, with fear and trembling, because she not only was going to be marked out as the one who troubled Jesus, as it were, but she was the one who was going to be known as the one who had been ritually unclean. According to the laws of Moses, she was unclean. And so there are various reasons she was fearful and trembling. She knew what had happened to her, and so she came and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. And verse 34, he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Your faith has delivered you or has saved you." This should not be understood as an expression of full salvation in the immediate context. Instead, it refers only to the woman's healing. Your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease. While he was still speaking, people came from the synagogue ruler's house saying, "Your daughter has died. Why trouble the teacher any longer?" But Jesus, paying no attention to what was said, told the synagogue ruler, "Do not be afraid. Just believe." He did not let anyone follow him except Peter and James and John, the brother of James. Remember those early three who joined Jesus as his disciples, Peter and James and John, and the three who accompanied Jesus to the Garden of Gethsemane, Peter and James and John, a special three among the 12 here, Peter and James and John. It says in verse 38, they came to the house of the synagogue ruler, where he saw a noisy confusion and people weeping and wailing loudly, is what it says here. Or another way of putting it would be the group probably includes outside or even professional mourners, just not family, because a large crowd seems to be present. In those days, they would have professional mourners who knew how to weep and knew how to wail, and on behalf of the family, they would come on these occasions and do just that. So this may very well be what was present for them as well. So verse 39, he entered, he said to them, "Why are you distressed and weeping? The child is not dead, but asleep. And they began making fun of him. Literally, they were laughing at him for saying such a thing. Right away then, it says he put them all outside. All of them. He threw them outside is the literal rendering. And the verb used here is almost always found in connotation with the force of mark that gospel of a lot of activity and a lot of events, one event after another. But Jesus essentially threw them all out because they weren't taking him seriously, his words seriously, and they were laughing. They were laughing at him. And then it says, toward the end of verse 40, he took the child's father and mother and his own companions and went into the room where the child was. Then, gently taking the child by the hand, try to imagine this. Do you try to imagine these events as though you were in these events right there with them? If this was your child who had just died, he took the child's father and mother and his own companions and went into the room where the child was. Then, gently taking the child by the hand, he said to her, Talite cum, which means, little girl, I say to you, get up. Well, the girl got up at once and began to walk around. She was 12 years old. They were completely astonished at this. He strictly ordered that no one should know about this and told them to give her something to eat. Though Jesus performs mighty miracles, he doesn't forget about, the impending physical needs that a person has, even though he may have just healed them supernaturally. So he wants to make sure she gets food to eat. And people were just astonished, completely astonished. It says here at the end of verse 42, just another amazing miracle for these people to see. The disciples earlier out on the sea, after he calmed the wind and the waves with just his spoken word, where it became a dead calm, they said, "Who is this? Even the wind and the sea obey him." Of course, it was God in that boat with them. And now this miracle here, the parents are astonished, fearful. He still gives them orders that no one should know about this, but at the same time told them to give her something to eat. He wanted to take care of her too, even though it was clear in his instructions that no one was to know about this. I think a major section that stands out in this passage is, don't be afraid, only believe. Don't be fearful, only believe. Matter of fact, let's go to that exact spot where Jesus says that. And if you find it before I do, that'll be great. Don't be afraid. Pardon? 30. Okay, thank you. See what it says here? At once the bleeding stopped in this woman, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease, and she knew at once, or Jesus knew at once, that power had gone out from him. Power had gone out from him. You don't see much by way of Jesus' miracles where it says specifically that power had gone out from him. But in the case where he healed this woman who had been bleeding for a long time, he turned around in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" And the response from the disciples, you see the crowd pressing around you, and you say, "Who touched me?" Like, how could you say that, Jesus? Just common sense would show that all kinds of people are going to touch you because of all the people around you. But he looked around to see who had done it. Then the woman, with fear and trembling. Fear is one thing. But then trembling, you're nervous, your arms, your legs perhaps are shaking out of that fear. Fear and trembling, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. One thing that I'll tell us is that we should never let fear and trembling keep us from telling the whole truth and nothing but the truth. It moved her to tell the Son of God everything that had happened. Jesus then said to her, verse 34, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." So, fearful, trembling, Jesus speaks to her as though she were his daughter. Your faith has made you well. You're well now. Jesus says, go in peace and be healed of your disease. The admonition is to believe him, to believe what Jesus has done, to believe what Jesus has said, to believe Jesus. Now, we know of other promises Jesus gives in the Bible, promises in relation to salvation, promises in relation to assurance of our salvation. Another incidental event where Jesus promises someone of full and complete healing, similar to this event. And the promise is to be calm, go in peace. Your faith has saved you. Be well. Salvation has come to your house. And he gives assurance to people by way of what he says about salvation having come near to them. And as a result, they were to be at peace, to know his peace, to know that their faith could be real, it could be strengthened, because salvation was a very close reality to their experience and to their lives. And that would have been reason enough for their fear and their trembling to turn aside, you see. Now, I have to ask myself during times when I've had fears or maybe tremblings as a result of fear, am I going to listen to the words of Jesus as he tells me to be calm, as he tells me to calm down, as he tells me to not worry? I can be in peace, that my faith has delivered me or saved me or healed me. I can know his peace now. And I no longer have to be concerned about the trepidation or anxiety I was feeling prior to his pronouncement and promise of peace.